Well, Carl, what a treat to be in a space together.
Together again. Maybe you should give a little background.
We've known each other for a very long time. My first job in publishing was with Alice Mayhew, who was a legendary editor, Carl's editor, Bob Woodward's editor, and
the editor of All the President's Men.
All the President's Men. So, but you know, even in all that time, I learned some new things about you in this book. And I learned that you can type with lightning fast speed.
Could.
I learned that you have a facility for reading upside down and backward. I learned that maybe I knew a little bit of this, but you have a mildly delinquent quality. That you play a super tight pinball game, and that you love secrets. And it all made me wonder, could you have been anything but a journalist?
I could have made it to a place called Loch Raven, which was the home for juvenile delinquents in Maryland. I was probably on my way. Let me take 1 second maybe to give you a brief notion of what this book, Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom, is. At 16, as you've indicated, I had 1 foot in the pool hall, 1 foot in the juvenile court, and about a toe in the classroom. And I was lucky enough, through my father, who knew somebody at the Washington Star, the great afternoon newspaper, probably the greatest afternoon newspaper in the country at the time. He knew someone there, and on the strength of my typing, because I had taken typing with the girls in 10th grade, I'd had enough of shop classes, right? Enough of that stuff. And I got hired at age 16, and so the book is really about this kid, while still before his senior year in high school, who gets the greatest seat in the country at this amazing time in our history. While John Kennedy and Richard Nixon are running for president against each other. I was there from 1960 to 65, and pretty much everything I know about certainly journalism, an awful lot of it, and life, came from this incredible experience with these amazing tutors who were the greatest newspaper people of their day. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, why don't we go back to that for a second, because it does seem as if that was the thing that was meant for you. And in many ways, I read this book as a love story. And the great moment of falling in love, in meeting Cute, was you walking through the newsroom of the Washington Star. And it's just, there's so many beautiful descriptions, but I'm wondering if you could sort of take a moment and close your eyes and paint for those of us here a portrait of what it was like to walk through the Washington Star newsroom and the composing room in the early 1960s. It was a factory, right?
Pardon me?
It was a factory.
It is a newspaper factory. And our floor, the 5th floor, the newsroom itself, was our floor of the newspaper factory where the words were put together. And the rest of the place was to get the word out, to print it, publish it, get ads, etc. So literally, I mean, here's this aisle here in the middle. The first day I got there, I'll close my eyes even for a second. Reporters on either side. The most glorious commotion in the nation going on. Copy, yelling, give me coffee, get me this, so give me rewrite. It's just this, they were really like a movie going on, 5 editions a day, people running, scurrying, screaming, smoking, putting out butts on the floor. And truly the most glorious moment of my life was the first time that the guy who hired me led me down this center aisle. And then my first day that I went to work there, the head copy boy took me slower down that aisle, and he stopped at various desks because it was earlier in the day and there weren't very many people there. And he stopped on the way at 3 desks. And he said, This desk is Mary McGrory's desk. The greatest, he said, she's the greatest prose writer in newspapers today. And she, of course, became a Pulitzer winner. Actually, she won her Pulitzer at the Washington Post for Watergate. I think I'm right about that. She later went to the Post, like I did. Next one, Miriam Ottenberg. Won a Pulitzer this year, the year that he's taken me down for investigative reporting. Next desk he stops at, Mary Lou Werner, Pulitzer, for covering opposition, so-called massive resistance to desegregation in Virginia. So right away, these three remarkable people, all of whom had a huge influence on my life, three women, the greatest women as any I've ever known, who practiced this craft. And then upstairs, duplicate, and then it seemed like it was 5 football fields long, this huge array of desks, this haze of smoke. And then there was a contraption that took the copy paper, the stories that were written, and a copy boy would fold it together, put it cinched like a belt in this contraption. It would take it upstairs through a manhole cover to the composing room upstairs where it would be set in type. And upstairs, the copy boy's job would also be to run up through that manhole cover, or an adjacent manhole cover, to get the page proofs. And the page proofs would have been, all the type would have been set by these rows of these giant machines, linotype machines, looked like giant looms in a mill. And it was a word mill. And there was this sense of everybody was there, including the composing room, compositors, the men, all men in the composing room, to get this paper out. And this paper was the fabric of the city, two cities, the nation's capital, and I'm a second-generation native Washingtonian, and the city I knew from my bicycle and being in the alleys. So that's this setup, and everything was about getting that paper out 5 times a day. And this great city editor who became my mentor, Sid Epstein, I'm lucky enough to have had probably the greatest 2 editors you could have, Ben Bradley and Sid Epstein, very different, but at the same time, the same principles. And Epstein would say, you know, get it right, write it tight, no mistakes. That was it, 5 editions a day. That was the deal.
So there's something in that, and I wonder,
Whoa, that's me, I think.
Oh, good.
Thank you. I talk a lot. My wife will tell you, I talk with my hands.
Yeah. It seems in a way that journalism, at least at that stage, you were really connected to the means of production. You know, you would write, and then you would see it put together. You would feel the building rumble when the presses started rolling. You'd hear the trucks pulling up out front to take the paper, and there are a few facts from the book that caught my eye that I wanted to share and then have you reflect on. One, you know, the printer's salary at the time was as high as a reporter's salary, $155 a week. You were a local at this place, and you know, you look at a lot of news organizations right now, and they are not primarily homegrown. You didn't graduate from college. You skipped a lot of high school. TV was not yet a presence. And I'm wondering how those data points affected the journalism then, and how the disparities that have taken place since then, whether it's the wage gap or being disconnected from the thing that you are producing, has changed journalism.
Well, let's take them one at a time, but the first thing is this unified sense of the mechanical, the editorial, the writing of the stories, the covering of the stories, and the idea that we had a mission. And also, the Star was very much a part of the fabric of the city in a way that the Post was not. It was a better paper than the Post. We had an absolute belief at the Star, and we were right, that the Post bled news and opinion in a way that even approached being unprofessional. And that we had a very strict separation of church and state, meaning between the editorial function, the opinion pages, and the reportorial paper itself. The idea that we were both the nation's capital and this piece of an essential fabric of the city and the country. And I don't think there's ever maybe been a newspaper quite like that, because it was the capital of the United States. It was the paper that was read. It had the greatest circulation in the city until the Post bought the opposition, another paper, the Times Herald, in 1954. But the Star, for a century, had been the dominant paper in the city. And so that the agenda of the city and the nation had an awful lot to do with this newspaper.
And you were connected to I mean, so why then did the Star ultimately fail? I mean,
why do you mention television?
Yeah.
Because you said there's no television. When I went to work was the beginning of really the switch toward television news. Viewers, particularly in the suburbs, watching television news, because you could no longer, as people and subscribers moved farther out into the suburbs in the 60s, it was very, very difficult to get the paper out to the suburbs because of the traffic. And so by the time the paper would get out to the suburbs, people were starting to watch television news in the afternoon. And that really had a lot to do with the demise of afternoon papers. But also, it was a period, when I went to work there were a number of reporters that had not graduated from college, especially those who had, been at the paper since World War II. And at the same time, they had begun a recruitment at Ivy League colleges. So all the new reporters that were being hired at the Star were coming in young reporters were coming in from Ivy League colleges instead of, like me and a number of us who were very close, who had grown up in the city and incidentally, we talk about it later, I have this belief that one of the things that we've got to do in the news business is make our newsrooms, news operations more reflective of who the people in this city, state, country are. Not just that we are guilty of real elitism in terms of who the people in the newsroom are. I think it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem of perception for people who don't like us very much to begin with. And this is one where they might be kind of right on. But we need dropouts, working class people who are reporters, who understand what this part of life is about, that we don't, who've had this other experience.
I was wondering just on stories that are missed. You have a really wonderful picture of covering the March on Washington, and the Star's effort. You said the Star put in like phone lines, and you remember reviewing the maps, which was sort of like the D-Day invasion, and some of the best reporters at the time were on it. I mean, Haynes Johnson, and yet there's this moment where you're looking at the Star's front page day after, or that day, that evening, and
August
concluding
22nd,
that you missed the story.
It was really unusual because the Star was so acute and would beat the Post day after day after day. And on the March on Washington, and the lead story was written by my other great mentor, Haynes Johnson, who also came to the Washington Post, gave me my first byline when I was 17 years old, an obituary on page 1 of the Star. But I had gone to the March area near the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument early in the morning on my way into the office, and I started talking to people. I thought it was the most moving experience I had ever had, quite honestly. I grew up in a household, my parents were active in desegregating Washington, and we ought to talk maybe a minute about the fact that Washington was a Jim Crow town when I grew up there. I went to legally segregated schools in the capital of the United States. And here in New Orleans, you know something about this, but how many people here knew that the capital of the United States had segregated school by law? Anybody? One person, two people. Incredible. So Brown versus Board of Education, when I was in the 6th grade, integration, desegregation of schools everywhere except the District of Columbia, because Brown covers only the states. DC is not a state, so there's a companion case. Companion case is the DC Board of Education. One case is under the 14th Amendment, the other is under the 5th Amendment, and both desegregation orders promulgated by the Supreme Court in opinions written by Chief Justice Warren. This was a Jim Crow town like here. Black people couldn't eat in restaurants downtown. They could only go to government cafeterias until 1952, when Reconstruction laws were upheld by the Supreme Court saying black people could eat downtown in the capital of the United States. So I just want to give how much the fact of Jim Crow America cast this pall over our lives. In my 5 years at the Star, bracket the Civil War by exactly 100 years. And that pall really defined our existence and what we covered. In another example, not just the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 5 and the Civil Rights Act of those 2 years. The local citizens associations in a neighborhood where I lived, there was a black association, there was a white association. Civic associations were black, citizens associations were white. This was a Jim Crow capital of the United States.
But these collisions were starting to come to a fore. You cover a football game between Eastern and I think St. John's where a fight breaks out.
The high school championship between the public schools and the Catholic schools. Big Thanksgiving Day kind of classic tradition in the city. That year, 1962, I believe it was, and I was there covering it, became a riot. And dozens wounded, taken to hospitals, chairs broken over people's heads, a lot of knives used. It was a terrible, terrible event. But let me just frame the period also that we're looking at here. When I went there, Kennedy, Nixon. I'd been there 2 weeks, and the state editor, Maryland editor, who lived around the corner from me, said, "Carl, you know, Kennedy's coming to your high school tomorrow. Why don't you go and help our guy cover it?" So I've been there 2 weeks, and I'm suddenly covering a candidate for the President of the United States. And sure enough, I got together with the chief political reporter. He said, "Okay, you know the grounds. You take notes on the crowd. All I want to know is, don't try to get fancy. Just tell me, because I'm going to be with the candidate, and you're going to be there first." And it turned out there were 20,000 people or something like this. Turned out at my high school. It was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I would say about a third or half of the story in the paper the next day was from my notes.
Yeah.
So and then a couple weeks later, let's just give you an idea, part of the joy of this, the head copy boy, and we were given, everybody at the paper was given this little yellow identification card. It looked like, and it had kind of filigrees and was very official looking. And I got mine laminated and put it around my neck like people are wearing here today. And the head copy boy says to me, "Carl, Go out to Burning Tree Country Club out in the suburbs. Ike, still the President of the United States, is playing golf, and our photographer is there getting pictures of him, and we need his film back here for late editions of the paper. So he says, you get the film, hurry back here in the cab with the film. So I go there, I go to Burning Tree, got my yellow tag, I flash it at the caddy shack or whatever it is, the head caddy, and the director of the sports facility there says, okay, go right out. Caddy will take you out there. I go out there, and the caddy takes me, and I figure the President of the United States out there 1,000,000 miles away, and I'm going to meet the photographer. The President of the United States is right where you are. He's sinking putts. Ike is there going like this. And by then, I carry a notebook with me. I take a few notes. And I could see that Ike had these brown spots on his hands. Brown spots. I don't know what I was going to do with the notes, but I just want to stay there as long as I could. And it was amazing. You know, it's the first time I'd ever seen a president of the United States, except my mother said that when I was a year old, she took me to FDR's funeral as it passed the White House. And then the photographer signally took out 35 millimeter rolls of film, and back to the office I went. And later I looked at those notes. I kept those notes about Ike's brown spots on his hand.
So, you know, that leads to another, so what in that can tell us all about becoming a reporter? You know, you mentioned covering the inaugural that you had, or the inaugural parade. That I think
Jack Kennedy's inaugural.
I think the quote you use is that you recognize that you need to look for everything within your sight, I think is the quote. Talk a little bit about what needs to go into a story and how you gather and make sense of the world, and then try to, you know, encapsulate it in words.
First of all, I think what you get in this book, I didn't realize it until I'd finished writing it. You know, there are 50 years that separate this book and All the President's Men. And they really, I mean, I think I'm right about this. They really fit together like this. And the book ends before I go to it. It ends with me at the Star. And when I have to leave because I haven't graduated college, even though they've made me a reporter already, but I have to graduate college, they say, to stay a reporter. So I left. It really ends on a sad note. And we'll talk about that later. But pretty much everything I know, I learned there. And you see, I think, a lot of things Bob and I, there's a quote from Bob on the cover, I think, there, that talks about what we did in Watergate. There's a lot of elements that come from this experience I had at the Star. And you know, nobody in the world is more perseverant than Bob, more even than me. And but he is really in a league by himself there. But that whole idea of perseverance, you're always, you know, you're not looking at the clock saying, I got to go home. You're looking and saying, it's 4 o'clock. Maybe there's something else that I can learn, or I can go out on my own and do it. You'll see through this book. A lot of what I covered were things that, not that I got from the desk, just as we did in Watergate. The desk didn't tell us, go here, go there, do that. We figured this stuff out. And so a lot of it is about imagination. What is news? Seems to me is the most important function of a reporter and a news institution, defining what is news. Not just the great story, let's say right today, the decline of democracies all over the world, 20, 30, 40 democracies now become authoritarian states, fascist, neo-fascist, authoritarian, not by coups, but by plebiscite, citizens choosing it. What is news? That's really news. What is news? There's a wonderful story in here that I love. At the 1964 Republican convention, Barry Goldwater was going to be nominated in San Francisco. And I knew a bit about Goldwater, read like everybody in the papers about him, and we covered him. And I knew he was a ham radio operator. And Goldwater being a little quirky, as Woodward and I later write in all the President's Men in the final days, he decided to take his home ham radio equipment to the San Francisco convention and play at being a ham radio operator while he was going to get nominated for being President of the United States. Go figure. I said, this is interesting. I wonder if I could have an interview by ham radio with Goldwater. So I called a press person for the campaign. He said, sure, yeah, the candidate would love it. Absolutely, 5 o'clock. So I go out to Arlington, Virginia. There's some ham radio guy. Go down the basement. He's got all this equipment. And all of a sudden, Goldwater's voice, this is Zulu Warrior X-Ray Queen. And I say, well, this is Zulu Warrior X-Ray King. And he says, I'm working at 30 megawatts, this, that, and the other thing. I got a rig. I got a thing going out the window here. I hear you loud and clear. X-ray 345, over. Let me keep going on talking in this talk that I know nothing about. I don't understand a word. And then I say, Senator, do you think you have the nomination wrapped up? He says, yeah, we're going to lose X number of states. We didn't expect to lose them, but it's a sure bet. End of interview. Fun. That's the deal.
No, look, broadcasting from the Mark Hopkins Hotel.
Yeah.
We only have a couple minutes before we want to open this up to the crowd, but there's one passage, you talk a lot about the times, the ground is really shifting in the years that you are there. And as a close observer, you couldn't help but be affected by it. And there was really a remarkable passage that stood out to me when you're talking to Rita Schwerner that I was hoping maybe you would read to the group because...
You want to explain who Rita Schwerner is? This is at the time, and by then I had covered a lot of civil rights stuff in the city, in Maryland. Somebody had once said to me, a great civil rights leader, Maryland is really the South. And the eastern shore of Maryland is the deep South. And the eastern shore of Maryland is Mississippi, was the quote. It's true. And so this is about Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, the three civil rights workers from the North, white, who had gone to Mississippi to try and register voters. And were missing in that summer of 1963, I believe. And let me see where the quote starts.
Let's start with
and I'm going to back up before I read and say, Woodward and I, at the beginning of Watergate, where we were asked, by some other reporters, what is it you guys are doing? We're a little unsure that you local kids know what you're doing, but what is it that you're putting in the paper? And we said it's the best obtainable version of the truth. And that has remained something of both Bob and I, and Shipley can tell you how close Bob and I are. We're like siblings, and that includes the ups and downs, but we are really joined at the hip. But that has remained what we say, really what reporting is. And then I'll tell you what I add as a corollary to that in this book. So one day the assistant city editor tells me that Rita Schwerner, the wife of one of the missing civil rights workers in Mississippi, is coming to Washington to see her congressman and the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, because she doesn't think that the federal government and the FBI is doing enough in the search for her husband and the two other missing workers. And indeed, she was right. And so I was to meet her at National Airport. She was coming off the plane. And let me just see here.
Take a break.
Right. And I had gone with her first to the Justice Department, to the office of Nicholas Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, who she had seen there. And then she went to the White House to see Lyndon Johnson. And I write in this passage, there was no way to look at Rita Schwerner and weigh the facts on the ground in Washington and Mississippi and not feel a personal identification with her and the rightness of what was being fought for at this moment in history. It leaped out at you and transcended the particulars of scribblings in your notebook. It was tangible, and that was being reflected in the stories filed from the South by the Star's reporters and other newspapers. The old 50-50, down the middle, half on one side, half on the other approach, was giving way to real reporting that was closer to the truth. Because for all the right reasons, the truth was not neutral. The desk had given me only 16 column inches to work with. It took me about 3 hours of struggling to write my story. I didn't want a single false note in there. In the last 2 graphs, I still get emotional about this, of the story, Rita Schwerner had expressed an awful truth. Mrs. Schwerner said her experience, quote, has left me wondering just how long it will take, end quote, before violence ceases to be part of the struggle for Negro rights. Quote, I thought when those little girls were killed in Birmingham that would be the end, she said. And I thought that Medgar Evers, and I'd covered Medgar Evers' slaying also, would be the end. And I thought, but now I think that when people in this country decide they want it to be the end, it will be the end. The truth is not neutral. A lynching is not neutral. And we've been yoked by this belief in journalism that somehow we've got some obligation to give 50% of the space in the story to one side and 50% to the other, that this somehow is real reporting. It's not. Look at the great reporting out of the South in the Civil Rights era, done mostly by white Southerners. There's nothing neutral about a lynching. And just think of it this way. Just think of a bank robbery. Guy goes in, points the gun, says, give me the money, gets the money, runs away, isn't heard for a month, but there's a video camera that took pictures. Meanwhile, he finally gets arrested 50 miles away. He's hiding out with his family, with some cousins. He's arrested, and he says, and he and his lawyer say, look, I didn't do this. I've been hiding out here. All these people will swear to it. And he goes on, and he's got some things he's written that are falsely dated, shown to be there, and one thing and another. And the reporters there are taking down all these notes. But then the reporter takes a look at the video camera, and there's a guy with a gun. Give me all your money. You're going to give 50% of that story to the notes the guy has written down that obviously are false? And 50% to the video camera? You give 50%, 90% to the video camera. Truth is not neutral. We got to get away from this idea. Now there's this whole trend, including at the cable networks, at CNN, the idea that we need to somehow move toward centrism. The idea that the center ideology is any better an ideology, it's still ideology, than the left or the right, rather than the best obtainable version of the truth. I'll quit filibustering here.
Yeah, we've taken 9. I'm gonna no, but we've got we have 8 minutes. I'm going to ask all my other questions of you later, but I'm sure there are folks who have things that they would like to ask of Carl, and there are a few microphones up here. So please fire away. Take a breath after the peroration. Sir.
How well did the Post give you support with Katharine Graham and her husband after the death of her husband by suicide?
Well, the great thing in Watergate, we did our reporting and we did pretty well at it. We could not have done it without the support from the great editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, and the great publisher, Katharine Graham. I'm going to tell a really quick story. One day, not long after the break-in at Watergate, and these stories that we've been reporting that show that this thing is going toward the Nixon White House, a subpoena server comes to the paper. He's downstairs. I get a call from the guard at the desk saying there's a subpoena server for your notes here because there was a court case filed by the president's people. And I say, don't let him upstairs. I call Bradley. I say, there's this guy with a subpoena downstairs for our notes. And Bradley says, let me go talk to Katharine Graham. He goes up to Katharine's office, comes back down, comes over to my desk, and says, they're not your notes. Katharine says they're her notes. And if anybody is going to go to jail, it's going to be Katharine Graham. Think about the bravery and what that means. That's my answer. Thank you.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about how your process for memoir differs from your process for when you're writing a work of nonfiction, and maybe just a little bit about that process?
Well, you know, I never really thought about it, but I really have written 3 memoirs of sorts. All the President's Men with Bob, even though we put it into the third person, so it says Bernstein, Woodward instead of we. Then I wrote a memoir of my parents who were radicals in Washington, particularly working to end segregation in the city, but also testifying before the Un-American Committee, et cetera, in the McCarthy period, and growing up in that atmosphere, and now this one. I think the process is the same, relentlessly repertorial. Going on this book, I was lucky enough to have 2 things. I had my scrapbooks from the Star, and then I went and interviewed almost everybody I worked with who was still alive. All the President's Men, we had all of our notes, and we wrote that book actually pretty much, well, you know, we wrote that book in about 14 weeks. We wrote all the President's Men, and we didn't quite know how to write a book, but David's boss at the time, Alice Mayhew, took this thing we had written. All the words in all the President's Men were in this draft we wrote, but Alice knew how to chisel it and move it like a narrative, which we didn't quite know. It sounded like journalese, part of it would say, according to such and such. So the process, it's all about going out and getting the information. And even look at great fiction. Look at what Philip Roth or John Updike does in their fiction. They describe, they go out and report. Philip, you okay over there? Somebody,
That's all right.
some great public servant is just fallen from the wall. So that's basically what I would say. It's memoir, but you're also plumbing your deepest emotions if you're doing it right. And I think even on All the President's Men, we experienced some of that. Next question.
Hi. You talked about the demise of afternoon paper due to the popularization of television. And obviously we've seen that in the demise of local readership and local newspapers due to social media. So I guess I'm interested to learn about how this shifting landscape will affect investigative reporting.
First of all, I think the deal is done, and now we have to reinvent the wheel a little bit. That local newspapers, and happily this city is an exception. You have a vibrant, local, terrific newspaper with a great editor, with great investigative reporters. Look at the story, it was on the front page yesterday. And And hopefully everybody here will double down on their subscriptions and have 2 subscriptions to the Times-Picayune. Look, Bob and I, again, you've heard some of it, have done a lot of talking about this. It's the old methodology that works. It's not about going on Google and thinking you can get a story by going to Google. And both Bob and I have taught college, and so many, and also at newspapers. So many young people come in and think they can cover the story by just going online. You got to get out of the office. You got to go talk to people. That's how and you got to be a good listener. And let people tell you their story. They'll try to tell you their truth, even if it turns out it's not the best obtainable version of the truth. It becomes part of that as you process what they're telling you. That's what we have to do. So how do we create models that draw on centuries? And there are centuries of great reporting. And also, it's like doctoring. Great reporting is the exception, not including all these. But these local papers that have been the fabric of our communities that report on high school sports as well as what the city council is doing and who has his hand in the cookie jar in letting a road construction contract, whatever. So how do we, there's a model right now, the Texas Tribune, which has become the most important news organization in many ways in the state, more so than the Austin American-Statesman. They've come up with a model that started with philanthropy and now is self-sustaining. Great reporting. I think I have 50, 60 reporters. Don't hold me to that, or I think it's close to that. And now the founding editor, Evan Smith, is going to try to take this model around the country. There are many, many ways. We are living in a golden age of investigative reporting. Nonprofits all over the world. Look at the reporting out of Russia by brave reporters, a good number of them now dead. Great reporting. So we need to find a way, and especially the role of local news in this country, and forget television local news, lead and bleed, as we called it even in the days I was at the Star, is pretty much hopeless. So there are ways to do this, and I think that's one model. You have another model here that happens to be working. Also, remember that it wasn't the internet that really killed local reporting. It started when chains like Gannett came into newspapers all across the country. Bought papers, local papers, stripped them of their reporters, then bought a second paper in a 2-paper town, closed one of them down. That is where the death of local newspapers begins. I mean, at the end of the 20th century, newspapers in America were earning 19% profit. Pretty good profit return. That's before the internet dominated. So I think our task is to find ways to do what we've always done best, to get reporters and get them out of the office and go to where the stories are and use common sense and be good listeners, and meanwhile use also local people, philanthropists. We've got to get everybody involved and say, we need this. Just help us get it started, and we're going to be able to keep it going like the Texas Tribune has with this model, or then adjust the model to the community. But just remember what smaller cities in America were like before they lost their newspapers, and how the fabric of these communities no longer has the public square. These papers were the public square. We need them.
And then the one thing I would add is that it takes time. It's not till page 263 that you actually become a reporter.
Yes, that's
which
fair.
Speaks to the apprenticeship. Anyway, we have gone over time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.